So yesterday, several of the panel discussions highlighted the critical role that data plays. Data that we have acquired during the pandemic, data used in optimizing pilot training, and data on disruptive passengers. This morning, we are going to be taking a deep dive into the data that becomes available through our voluntary safety programs. So with that said, I would like to invite Captain Jeff Mee and his panelists to come on stage and take their seats. So before our panel starts, let's briefly go over today's lineup of Air Safety Forum activities while they come on stage. Following this panel, we will have a networking break. Then our second panel of the day will discuss UAS, followed by lunch. Before we begin our afternoon program, Captain DePete will honor the Airport Safety Liaisons and Airport of the Year with the awards for the past 3 years. Following the awards presentation, we then have the honor of hearing from Andy Cook, Transport Canada's Associate Director, General of Civil Aviation, and then we conclude the 66th Air Safety Forum with a distinguished panel from industry and government, including Captain DePete, to talk about airspace integration. Of course, our annual awards reception and banquet are scheduled for tonight at 5 p.m. with a reception hosted by Airbus, followed then directly by the banquet, and concluding with another post-awards reception from 10 to 11 p.m., so please do stick around for that. We have a very, very busy and information-packed day, so let's get started. I now turn the floor over to you, Jeff Mee, and for a deep dive on data. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Good. All right. Thank you, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to ALPA's Air Safety Forum. I'm Jeffrey Mee. I'm the Accident Analysis and Prevention Chairman here with ALPA. And today we'll have our discussion, Crunching the Numbers. Our goal here, we want to look at ways data is being used to take a proactive approach to identifying and mitigating risk, as opposed to a reactive approach, making recommendations after an accident. According to the Bureau of Transportation Statistics, during the 10-year period from 1990 to 2000, there was an average of over 90 fatalities per year from commercial aircraft accidents. Accident investigation was the primary method of discovering deficiencies and recommending safety change. We're now arguably in the safest period of commercial aviation history ever. For the period from 2010 to 2020, that average dropped to 1.6 fatalities per year. That's only 16 fatalities from commercial aviation accidents in the entire decade. While accident investigation will always continue to be an important part of our safety culture, in some ways we're a victim of our own success. That's in that accidents are far less frequent. I think we can all agree this is a good thing. But for fewer accidents mean fewer opportunities to learn and develop changes necessary to make aviation even stronger. This is no surprise to those of you that have attended previous air safety forums. On this very stage, we've witnessed the development of voluntary safety programs going back to the 1990s. We've talked about FOQA, ASAP, and the evolution of SMS. These programs were the beginning of a change in culture from punishment for errors to an acceptance that people are fundamentally trying to do the right thing. But mistakes can happen. Being in the audience, I'm sure you know a few pilots. You know we tend to be type A people. We take pride in doing our job well, or said another way, accidents are rarely an intentional act, but a result of errors. This evolutionary change to a non-punitive culture has fostered an environment where people can self-disclose their errors or share insight into safety concerns they have witnessed, thereby creating a substantial database of events that could have led to an accident. These programs have allowed us to further reduce risk. However, these programs are focused on change at an airline level. Each airline doesn't operate independently. They are part of a much bigger system where there's thousands of flights a day operating into busy airports. How do we translate these safety advantages from an airline to a systemic level? That started through the Commercial Aviation Safety Team, or CAST, back in 1997. This group brought together the FAA, airline safety managers, and employee groups to use the insights in their various aspects of aviation, to use data, both publicly available and agreed upon, de-identified data, to conduct research and affect change. By 2008, there was a reduction in the fatality risk for commercial aviation in the United States by 83%. This was in no small part due to the activities of CAST, for which they were recognized by the National Aeronautics Association when they received the Collier Trophy that same year. In fact, since the inception of CAST, the fatality risk for commercial aviation has been reduced to 96%. These successes highlight the accomplishments of the United States, but aviation is also a worldwide industry. To further pursue a systemic approach, we must consider how to reduce risk in this expansive global system. The panelists here to my left are familiar with these challenges and successes. Today, we hope to highlight some of the processes that have achieved so much while continuing to add safety to our system. We may also gain some insight into how this success story will spread worldwide. I'd like to introduce the panelists, starting here with Vivek Sood. He's the technical advisor on vulnerability discoveries and safety measures and the industry chair for JIMDAP. We have Kyle Quackenbush. He's the lead systems engineer for MITRE Corporation, who leads the information sharing and strategic outreach group and works closely with JIMDAT on the data analysis. And we have Captain Mike Shills. He's a Delta A330 captain, a longtime ALPA volunteer, and he's our industry chair for JIMDAT. So with that, I'd like to ask Vivek, you've been a part of CAST for a long time. Could you briefly give us a little bit of background on how CAST came to be and how it was so successful in reducing risk?
Okay. Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks.
As you can tell, Mike and I are interchangeable, so industry government chair, we kind of flip-flop very easily. But kind of like Jeff said, we are in the safest period of commercial aviation safety today. But the path that we took to get here is certainly filled with tremendous challenges, and I think all of you in the audience know that well. 25 years ago, we didn't enjoy this level of safety. We certainly had challenges with accidents and incidents that were occurring. And there were two critical reports that came out at that time, the White House Commission on Safety and Security, as well as the National Civil Aviation Review Commission. And both of those reports kind of challenged the industry and the government to come together collaboratively and address the accident rate. It was not acceptable. We all knew that. But it was a challenge in how we go about and reduce it. And they set a goal for us. 80% reduction in the fatal accident rate in commercial aviation over 10 years. A goal that was considered mission impossible at the time. But looking back, I think it also reflects on when we all get together on a shared common safety goal, what we can accomplish. As Jeff mentioned, by 10 years later, we had an 83% fatality risk reduction. That was quite remarkable. And as you look at our system, we learned from the tremendous loss of life that we did have. We had lessons learned, and we certainly addressed those gaps that were there. But that was a reactive approach, and we knew we needed to go well beyond a reactive approach to a much more proactive approach. And as Jeff mentioned, the initial implementation of FOQA and ASAP was the transition. The transition from reading about accident reports to frontline professionals in our industry stepping up and saying, I think there's a safety issue here. Giving us that early warning to start looking at an issue and put in proactive mitigations. And as CAST was formed, we formed the JIMDAT, Joint Implementation Measurement Data Analysis Team. And that was really tasked with looking at the data, developing an analytical data-driven approach methodology and how we prioritize risk and how we address those. We had a Pareto. We started from the highest fatality risk. Where could we intervene and prevent the greatest loss of life? And we marched down that Pareto, very structured, But at the same time, 10 years later, we were well positioned to shift over to SIS data, which brought the voluntary information systems in to start looking at more incident type data and becoming more prognostic. But I think the core to CAS success was that all of us working together and analyzing and agreeing on a shared safety agenda, and going out with mitigations and voluntarily adopting. And I think that's the key word, voluntarily adopting. We all saw safety as a community shared responsibility. It was not an individual operator or the FAA alone to do it, but we worked together on the most effective mitigation strategies. We put them out, and industry as a whole voluntarily implemented them. And that's what kind of has enabled us to be remarkably successful, and I think that's the collaborative approach. That is the foundation upon which we have improved safety.
Okay. I'd like to move on to Mike. Vivek mentioned SIS and how that was such a significant role in sharing the data, using the data for doing analysis. We've been doing this a long time.
Yeah.
Being a part of GMDAT was a little bit eye-opening, but it's in terms of how the data is actually being used. You were a former FOQA gatekeeper. I get the sense from line pilots, as much as we've been talking about FOQA and ASAP over the years, there's still some misunderstanding on how these programs work. So could you take a few minutes and kind of explain how our FOQA data translates into SIS and CAST? And if it helps, we've recently completed at GMDAT a project on misalignments. We could use that as an example.
Sure.
Thanks.
I started at Northwest Airlines as a gatekeeper, an ALPA gatekeeper in the FOQA program. And I was blessed because Northwest had one of the best FOQA programs at the time. So if you're going to learn, you might as well learn from the best, right? And I spent 3 or 4 years doing that, and one of our safety guys at Northwest said, "Hey, I'm stepping down from my place at the issues and analysis team at SIS. Could you take over for me?" And I went to the glossary of acronyms and said, "What's a SIS and what's the IAT and why would I want to do this?" And it looked kind of interesting. It looked like that's where ASAP and FOQA information went to be used on a much broader scale. And the issues and analysis team was was the workhorse of SIS. We did all the studies. We suggested to SIS what studies should be done and who should do them and how they should be done. So we wielded a little bit of power, and we did some great work. And we were also there when Fusion came about. Thou shalt never mix ASAP and FOQA data, right? They shall be separate. They shall never be used to augment one another. Guess again. About the time we started thinking about fusing that data at SIS, we were merged with Delta Airlines, and all of a sudden we were looking at crosstalk and where you could make ASAP better by using FOQA data for at least making your corrective actions more meaningful, okay? We got to Fusion, which was not an easy get. I don't know if Frank Bisogni is here, but Frank and I went round and round for a time. He was the Safety Council chairman, and it took some convincing, and it took some rules that we could live with to get Fusion at SIS, but we got it. And basically now the SIS folks take our FOQA data, our ASAP data, fuse it with about 50 or 60 other bits of data so that you get a much better look at what the NAS, the National Airspace System, what's going on out there, okay? It has really helped with our studies. I think our first study was the go-around study that is just winding up, but it was our first study under Fusion, and we were all very excited about it. And we took the first swipe at looking at fusion data and found out we had like 7 or 8 records that fused perfectly together. And I was like, well, this is going to be kind of slim pickings if we don't get another dump of information. And eventually we did. It's kind of a slow process. This data doesn't flow quickly some days, but we're there. And through a lot of hard work by a lot of people in this room, we're there, and it's paying benefits. It seems like it's never easy getting there, but that may be because it's so fruitful once you finally do get there. Sometimes it's hard to explain exactly all the benefits to the people who are benefiting from it. But trust me, having done this for 20-some years now, we wouldn't let you get bamboozled when it comes to where your safety data is going, okay? But it starts with you. It starts with our pilot groups. If your guys and gals aren't sending in ASAP reports, this dies on the vine, okay? I tell people when I am invited to speak, as a professional pilot, that's part of your responsibility. Because it may be just the 2 people up in the cockpit who see this problem. You may be the only 2 people on the planet who know it. And it's sort of your responsibility to share it with your pilot group in the industry so that the next 2 people that come upon this predicament have some tools to fight it. So that's sort of the basis of all we do.
And that's the really value added, right?
Absolutely.
Often pilots see ASAP as, I did something wrong, this is my get out of jail free. But the real value in the data are those examples where we would not know unless we had reports from the pilots flying the line.
Yeah, it's not so much to get out of jail free, it's to keeping the next 2 people safe.
Yeah. And FOQA. We get FOQA data. That's sometimes seen as Big Brother watching us. But it's the same event. We really would get data we normally would not get in events. Could you maybe talk for a minute as a FOQA gatekeeper? How you would make a crew contact, or possibly why?
Sure. I used to tease one of the guys in the office. I said, yeah, we work with zeros and ones, and he was the 1 and I was the 0. You're looking at a readout of all these different parameters, and you're trying to put an end to whatever story you're looking at, okay? Why did the crew react to this the way they did? That's all you're looking for, okay? Or how did you get yourself in the situation where these parameters showed up on your FOQA data, okay? As a FOQA gatekeeper, I had a really simple rule. 9 times out of 10, I was calling some captain who was flying an airplane I wasn't qualified on. So you got 1 of these and 2 of these. So listen twice as much as you talk, okay? And I'd introduce myself and say, hey, I'm the ALPA guy in the FOQA program, and I'm just trying to get an idea of how you got in the situation you were in and how you handled it. And I'd take a ton of notes. Sometimes I would be requested by, at the time we had fleet reps, okay? So that would be an instructor on that fleet. Hey, could you take a look at this and just let me know how they got there or how they got out of it or why this showed up the way it did? And of course, never using names, employee numbers, anything identifiable, I'd call the fleet rep and say, hey, I talked to the captain on that flight you wanted me to look at, and this is what happened, and this is how it ended. Well, he would take that information, go back to his fleet and say, hey, you know what? This is the 5th time this month we've had this situation. We might want to include something in our next batch of training, okay? We may want to train this differently. We may want to make the other people on our fleet aware of what these guys or gals what they had happened to them.
Yeah, so the crew outreach is really about validating the data, answering the questions that you didn't see in the ones and zeros.
Absolutely. And like I said, if you look at it realistically and realize, hey, you're an A320 captain, you're talking to at the time, 747-400 captain. I'd hardly even jumped seated on the 400, so I knew nothing about it. I just wanted to know why were you taxiing at 50 knots? Well, it's Detroit, and we were all trying to make our commuter flights. And then you pass that along. And just say, hey, I talked to the guy, and then the 747-400 fleet captain would put out a bulletin to his guys saying, hey, I understand nobody wants to spend a night in Detroit. Not that there's anything wrong with Detroit. But, maybe you guys should think twice about taxiing at 50 knots while you have flight attendants up doling out coats and whatever. But that's how that information got passed along. Never with names, never with anything that identified the crew. The only person who knew the crew was me, and as soon as I got done reporting, those notes were in the incinerator or in the shredder or tucked away for blackmail. But no, they were done. I didn't want anything to do with them, so we trashed them.
And so our real value there is identifying trends and
absolutely.
negative trends we can use to help correct. I'd like to talk to Kyle for a few minutes on the MITRE side. Sitting in GymDat, it's very interesting to me how this data gets processed. I'm like Mike, ones and zeros didn't mean a whole lot, but I assumed it did to somebody, and you just do a search and here it is. But it's not exactly like calling Google. There's a lot of vetting that goes into it. There's a lot of data protection, as Mike had just talked about, where it's de-identified. And then there's a process where we have to use also identified data to paint the picture. If you wouldn't mind maybe talking for a few minutes about how the data is handled and processed.
Yeah, absolutely. So to get a sense of where MITRE fits into our public-private partnership and truly what we consider this, MITRE is the trusted third party within SIS, and we're entrusted by industry and in the government to ingest the data. Approximately 31 million FOQA records over the 5-year time span that the SIS program covers, and approximately 500,000 ASAP reports over that same 5 years period of time. So it's a lot of data, becomes a lot of challenges, and how we work across all that data to really bring out the information that's going to be impactful for the SIS program, in collaborating with the commercial aviation safety team and GymDat to provide meaningful information that's going to help us help the GymDat and the CAST make meaningful decisions and recommendations. So we mentioned the ALM study, the different governance issues, but the SIS is one of 14 different PPPs that MITRE operates, but it was the first PPP that we operated. So there's a lot of lessons learned. There's a lot of trailblazing when we talk about the ingest of data when we were developing the rules of the road for the SIS program. So over the 15 years, there's a lot of evolution that happens when you're considering that magnitude of data that we're ingesting for the SIS program. But it continues to evolve, and we work alongside, hand in hand with industry and government to make sure that those rules, the rules of the road and our policies and procedures are applicable for the information that we need to provide. And there's lots of challenges, and as you can imagine, as those challenges evolved at the beginning of SIS, it was trying to build that trust, the trust with industry, just that this is important, what we're trying to do. As Mike was pointing out, it's not about the individual, it's about the aggregate information and the trends that we can pull out of the data. And then as we moved on to Fusion, combining the FOQA and ASAP data, it was ensuring that the trust that we built is still there, and that we ensure that trust is maintained as we provided more details and transparency on how Fusion was going to work and how we were going to accomplish the goals that we had set out to do. It's not just the FOQA and ASAP data, the proprietary data that we receive from the airlines, but we fuse data with voice transcriptions, we fuse data with weather information, digital ATIS information that's available, publicly available radar tracks to build a complete story that otherwise you can't get from just reviewing the FOQA data, right? The FOQA data is the what, the ASAP many times tells you the why, but there's a lot of context that we can pull from our other data sources that help build that larger picture. And really did, right for the first time, helped us with the ALG study, and then also our misalignment study that you were talking about. As an example, the voice data, the voice transcriptions can help us determine what approach a crew is cleared, and that's something you can't pull out of the FOQA data. You mentioned the crew contacts, right? We don't have that information. We don't have the benefit of being able to pick up the phone and call the crew and ask, why were you taxiing 50 knots in Detroit? We have to build that context organically. So, yeah, there's the challenges are with how do you get to that full picture in the data, and with fusion information and what we've been able to accomplish, we're making steps in the right way to continue to evolve the ASIAS program, and working again with the gentleman to the left and right of me.
Okay. And that data is not easy to mine, like you said, with our misalignment project. A lot of it doesn't translate, right? You have to verify where the airplane was, or was it actually going 50 knots? And that's the part I found surprising. Everybody has GPS, and I think it was actually Vivek that had the comment. Why can't we just look at that data and see where they were? Well, it's not always that accurate, or there's interference, and sometimes you need to merge it with other sources, right? Like ASDX or something else.
Yeah, it's a really good point. So vetting the data and dealing with the data quality issues, right? We're ingesting data from more than 45 stakeholders in the ASIAS program on the within commercial aviation. That's 45 different ways of doing business. It's more and twice as many different fleet types. But even within that, it's exponentially more logical frame layouts in the boxes that are on those aircraft, right? So we're working diligently with industry to get that information, to understand how each individual airline is handling each individual fleet type and subfleet types, and that ingest process. It's not a simple plug-and-play system, but we're working with industry, we're working with the FAA to understand how the information comes in, so the data quality becomes less of an issue the more you work with it.
Yeah. Thank you. So with Mike, we talked about where the data comes from. With Kyle, we've talked about how it gets processed a little bit. Now back to Vivek. I know you're passionate about the programs CAST has. They have a stated goal of reducing the fatality risk another 50% by 2025. Could you talk a little bit about how these recommendations, these safety enhancements make it to industry? How do we become so successful?
Thanks, Jeff. Kind of building upon what Mike and Kyle have talked about, it's about looking at the data and looking at the trends and understanding the underlying factors. From a CAS standpoint, we have a prioritization model. It doesn't have to have a fatality risk. When we look at a safety issue, we evaluate it. And if we anticipate a catastrophic loss of an accident over the next 20 years, then it falls under CAS purview for action. And when a safety topic comes into our purview, just like ALM or go-around, we leverage all information that's available from ASIAS and try to understand the underlying factors. We look back at historical knowledge that we have of prior accidents. We form data analysis teams, and that involves government and industry SMEs from across the board that are related to that safety topic. And they go through a methodical process of looking at that data, developing underlying factors and event sequences, and we identify the problem statements and interventions that potentially could reduce that risk. And then we evaluate them in terms of, it's not like we can implement every single mitigation that we have. We don't have the resources. but which one would be the most effective in reducing the risk and cost beneficial? Implementation, like you said, how do we get the success, is finding that sweet spot between the risk reduction and the cost, and making that business case available to all who have a part in implementing that safety enhancements. We share that. We share the analysis in terms of the risk, what are the underlying factors, and then the operators and FAA themselves can take a look at the safety enhancements and see where from what they have deployed can be enhanced further or be changed or implemented. And then as Mike mentioned, the metrics that we have, we develop metrics to evaluate. So once we implement safety enhancements, CAS then evaluates the metrics to see that the desired trends in reduction of that risk. If we don't see a desired trend, then we go back in. Nothing that we mitigate is at 100%, but we can certainly evaluate, is there something else we can do or alternative approach? And that involves a lot of feedback between the implementers and also from the analysis team. One size does not fit all. The operations are unique and they're very different, and they have to evaluate and tailor that mitigation. But it's that conversation, and it's that providing the data and the underlying factors. Operators can certainly see, for example, what occurs within their operation, within the data of their purview. What ASIS brings to the table is a perspective of the collective. From a national perspective, what do we see? And we've done a very good job of addressing the high fatality risk areas. So what we're chasing now are rare events. And that could be experienced by an operator or maybe not. But that does not mean you're not exposed to the risk. So having the National Archives gives us that visibility and gives that information for that information to flow into the operator's SMS process that they can evaluate the risk and take mitigation. So it's a 360 approach. Analyze the data, provide that information out, develop mitigation strategies, and then evaluate how effective they're being.
In the mitigation strategies, like for our misalignment project, for example, you target different areas, right? We look at technology improvements, changes to procedures, changes to training, even changes within the FAA. Could you maybe give us a couple of examples from that?
Sure. So from a CAS approach, we don't put all our eggs in one basket. We do a layered mitigation approach. Those approaches from a safety enhancement could be procedures that air traffic uses, as well as technologies that were deployed on the ground or on the aircraft to alert the crew when there's a misalignment. Right, currently the FAA rolled out and has completed all of the ASIX airports technology that would alert the crew or would alert the controllers, and the controllers will alert the crew if they're misaligned on approach to anything other than a runway. So if you're aligned with a taxiway, it's going to alert the controllers will issue a go-around. So that's another trap. So try to prevent the misalignment from occurring, but then also acknowledging if it does occur, how can we mitigate that? And the OEMs and others have rolled out quite a bit of technologies that, depending on what you have dialed into your aircraft, will alert you. You are now approaching runway 22 and said you were cleared for 24. So it's a layered approach from the procedures to the technologies that we deploy. The advantage of the aircraft technologies, we don't have ASIX at all airports, but aircraft-based technologies, you carry that protection with you where that aircraft goes. So it's a layered approach, and I think that's where we kind of evaluate the implementation levels that we're having, and we're seeing a desired trend. And since we've had the Air Canada event, and with the mitigations that have rolled out, from a commercial perspective, do we still have misalignments? Yes, we do, but nowhere near the frequency that we saw prior to the study.
Yeah, and some of those are easy fixes per se through procedures. I think what you've really highlighted is the value added by having such a wide group of experts, right? We have the manufacturers, not just of the airplanes, but of the boxes, right? Honeywell, people that create some of using a technological advantage to identifying these trends. So, like you said, some of our enhancements we'd like to see in the future, knowing full well it'll take a long time to implement. And then some of them are what can we do now? How can we affect that, bring that back to airlines? I guess taking that idea, that collaborative approach, and you talked about it affecting the whole system. Well, unfortunately, we weren't able to bring our friend from IATA in, but with my work on AAP, being able to interface internationally with the International Federation of Airline Pilots, with groups like IATA, we look at accident trends worldwide, really. And I know you've been a part of that effort, including talking to Canada next month, Mexico. How do we, and I know Europe has a similar version to ASIAS that's about to roll out. How much input have you had on that? Maybe to kind of look into the crystal ball, where do you see us going?
And certainly, I think we've been very effective. And we talk about reducing the fatality risk in the U.S., and we've done a remarkable job. But that's not to say we're simply focused in the U.S. We're interested in reducing the risk, fatality risk to U.S. passengers. Our industry is global. And the data that flows into ASIAS gives us visibility into other areas outside of the U.S. And from the early stages of CAST, the resources that we as a community brought together to do the studies and the detailed analysis are simply not available in other parts of the world. So we always shared our learning with regional areas where we saw the accidents and tried to take our learning to them and help them adapt. Keyword being adapt. What works in the U.S. may not work somewhere else, but help them adapt those mitigation strategies regionally. Those gave way to ICAO regional safety teams. CAS is still very active in those areas, and seeing the success of CAS, we've seen it being emulated around the world. We certainly see the CAS model in Brazil, starting up in Mexico. It's that collaborative approach coming together and looking at data. We see from a data sharing initiatives, Data for Safety, which is a European collaboration we did early with them, as well as AppShare in Asia. They're learning from us, and what's advantage from us is that it's an opportunity for us to share how we develop metrics, which is key when we get to the regional safety areas. We certainly don't have the wide breadth of data from a global perspective, but if we can harmonize our metrics and our taxonomies, then when we get into the safety meetings, we're discussing apples to apples. And I think that's where it's been a tremendous advantage. We are completely harmonized with IATA and also with the EASA. So when we go to regional safety teams, what we share from our data at a high level of the risk areas we're seeing, there's a collaborative information being shared from IATA from their members. So I think that forms the opportunity, as we don't have resources to study everything, but into the future, kind of what you're pointing to, as we come together as a community, we have a common platform. I don't think we're talking about sharing data, but we're talking about sharing information, risk information, mitigation strategies. Certainly what could be present somewhere else in the world doesn't mean it doesn't exist in the US. We can share those resources. That way we're studying topic X, they're studying topic Y. We can bring that information to the global community, and that helps us improve safety globally. So I think there's a foundation for us to go well beyond. Safety knows no boundaries. The risk knows no boundaries. There's certainly unique geographic risk, but as these systems start to mature, it gives us a community that we can engage with and have the same level of success we've had in the US, but also globally.
I think it's also interesting working with IATA. There is no global regulator, right? We have ICAO. They make recommendations, standards. They have the regional safety teams, but unlike CAST in the US, where we're working directly between industry and the regulator, it's a little harder to implement change that way. And like you said, I think it's very important that we share this. We want to take that strategy, those mixed risk mitigations globally, to try and help with some of these issues that we all share. And I think that's really something I've found in common is there are so many things we all share. So whether or not the regulations are different, the challenges seem to be very similar throughout the world. And it'll be interesting to see where that goes. Let's see, I guess I could open this up really to anybody here on the panel, but with the early success of CAST, do you see a point where we may have some diminishing returns? You mentioned that we'll use the data and we'll keep revisiting it in this feedback loop to make sure that our safety enhancements, the mitigations we have in place are working, they're doing their job correctly, and hopefully without creating other unintended consequences, which is always the fear. But what do you guys think about that? What's in the future? How effective can we be at CAST? I certainly think it's got a lot of value added going forward.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with you, Jeff. I don't see a point where we wind up with diminishing returns. I just don't see a point where, well, we're never going to have the low-hanging fruit we've had the first 25 years, right? So So now instead of going after the 10s and 20s, we're going after the 0.5s and 0.4s and to try to get that other 50% in by 2025. So we're probably not going to make as big a splash, industry-wise. But one thing I did want to bring up, this ability to touch different organizations around the world, part of that's done amongst our own airlines. They've got all these co-chairs with, like with Delta, we co-chair with KLM and Air France. I know they get together quite often, and our safety team talks to their safety team about, hey, we have safety enhancements that suggest we do X, Y, and Z. This might work for you guys too. And some of our co-chairs might not be quite as affluent as the ones we work for. If you can save them time and energy and money in not having to reinvent the wheel, your whole organization winds up better. The whole airline organization winds up being better. So that's one of the great benefits that I see down the road as word of us spreads. You'll see what we're doing being more influential throughout the entire world. And in different modes of transportation. When Richard Anderson went to Amtrak, he took the idea of FOQA with him, and they've been trying to get a FOQA system up for their trains. I had the pleasure of discussing that with him. And, they have some rules that they have to work through, but if you get it through different modes of transportation, you can make other modes of transportation even safer. So we all wind up benefiting.
No reason to reinvent the wheel, right?
Right. Yeah.
We have
painful.
something that works and we can share it. I didn't even think to ask something like that.
I'd like to expand a little bit on what Mike was saying, and not necessarily the diminishing returns, but the challenges we're going to have to finding the hazards that are within the data that are low-hanging fruit any longer. We're really challenged to make sure that we're developing the methodologies to find the unknown unknowns and dig within the data. And we talked about fusion and being able to bring that contextual information together to really explore the breadth and the depth of the information or the data that we're ingesting. So I think that's really where we're going to be focusing, and it's not the large volume of hazards that we've seen come out of the SIS program in the past. We're really going to be working to make sure that we're ingesting the right data, exploring new data sources to bring in, and then making sure we've developed those methodologies to incorporate those new data sources to find the hazards that we're unaware of, right? The next accident is already in our data, right, as some folks will say.
Yeah, attributed to Kathy Fox, although she told us on Tuesday that she didn't actually say it, but she loves the phrase.
Yeah.
That is the challenge, right? How do you know what you don't know?
Mm-hmm.
And I would imagine with technology ever increasing, more and more data being available, that's probably a significant challenge.
I think that's a key point. I think what we have to keep cognizant of is we did not get here over 25 years very easily.
Yeah.
It's very challenging times, but our system is very dynamic. It is not static. As we've experienced it in COVID, a dramatic influx and impact on our industry. So our safety barriers that we have deployed, we can't be lulled into thinking they're going to be effective all the time. Yeah. And I think the process of leveraging data is to always test your safety barriers and see, are they being as effective? As technology advances, the world we live in today, the better we know, can we do something different to gain additional risk reduction? Because our system, our national airspace will keep evolving, and the challenge is for us to keep pace with it. And it took us tremendous time to get from a forensic approach to a more prognostic approach to managing safety. We all talk about being predictive, catching issues before they introduce into the NAS. We don't want to be reacting to a concern that we see in the NAS, but be proactive in anticipating the change we're implementing, how will that impact the NAS? Can we proactively put in mitigations prior to? And then evaluate, once you put in the mitigation, did it happen as we intended? If not, what did we not learn? So as urban mobility, UAS, space travel, all of those interact into our airspace, there will be new challenges. And as kind of Kyle indicated, we shifted from forensic to use of ASAP and FOQA, but I think all of you know, voluntary safety programs and SMS programs collect a lot more data. And we have to tap those data sources. Fatigue data, other data sources, LOSA data, they're not being leveraged at a national level. We have to find inroads to that type of data to gain that additional insight. Our aircraft will get more and more automated. Yeah. The complexities will happen. How do we stay abreast of those and address the mitigation? Because that's how we sustain, not only sustain the level of safety we have, but improve upon it. So we've had a tremendous road to travel. We have a lot of lessons learned, but there are a lot of challenges that remain ahead as our industry evolves and continues to evolve and expand again on how we sustain and build upon the level of safety we have.
Okay. For those of you in the audience, we'll get ready to take some questions before we conclude the panel. And while you're working your way to the microphones, I'll just ask the three of you, what didn't I ask? What's on your mind that I probably didn't bring up that you'd like to talk about?
Well, just personally, I've represented ALPA in a lot of different venues, and it's been a real privilege. I'm sort of coming to the end of this, and it's been a privilege representing all of you. I hope I did a good job. I hope we made a difference, but it's really been a thrill, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike.
Certainly, from what I've seen from the statistics, it's making a difference.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, especially since back in the 90s. Looks like we do have a question.
Jeff, how you doing? Steve Jangelis, Delta pilot, ALPA pilot, and the ESIAS Executive Board Industry Co-Chair. I just wanted to publicly say to you all, thank you for all the work that all four of you are doing to bring us the data. To bring us the data to the executive board to make decisions on some of these larger issues. As Mike, as you said earlier, you work with the ones and zeros and you bring us a finished product, all of you do, so that we can make those decisions to pass along to the industry where we need to make safety enhancements, what we need to do, and work with our partners in industry to make things happen. So to Kyle and your MITRE team, thank you for the hundreds of smart people you have working there putting this data and crunching it. We appreciate all your efforts. And to Vivek and your team at the FAA, thank you. You've provided us a lot of good info, and I just wanted to say thanks for your efforts during the COVID period. There was a period there when we were seeing each other weekly on Zoom calls.
Never again.
Yeah, and Mike, your efforts at the GymDad were appreciated during that period because as a lot of people don't know, while everyone was at home doing Zoom calls, there was a lot of efforts because we had an industry that got turned upside down. As far as risk was concerned, I think we were all concerned about it, and I just wanted to say thank you for your efforts throughout that period. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
Looks like we have another question from the audience.
Good morning, and my dear friend Steve stole my thunder somewhat. So on top of that, what I'd like to say to all of you in the room, after 9 years of being a council rep in Chicago, in fact, I'm an ALPA pilot that happens to fly for United Airlines. The committee structure at ALPA, from its basic at the council level all the way up through national, is the backbone of our union. And so much work goes on in the committee structure that pilots never see. And I want to thank every committee member throughout the entire ALPA organization. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Looks like Rich Huey has a question for us.
All right, thanks.
Oh, I didn't see you, Frank.
Oh, thanks. Well played.
I saw you, Frank.
Frank Bizonia. I'm a United pilot. I'm an ALPA pilot, and I currently serve as the ASO safety chairman. Mike, been working with you for years. Jeff, it's going to be hard to see you go. But basically just want to expand on, I've been doing safety work for over 20 years, and the collaboration and trust issue is by far leaps and bounds ahead of when I started as far as the industry, labor, and the regulator. Can you expand on the need for trust and collaboration, and how it enhances safety?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a favorite story I tell about one of the guys that taught me how to be a gatekeeper. When we merged with Delta, their program was in suspension for a bunch of reasons I don't even want to go into because we'd never leave. But we had these weekly meetings, and one of the gatekeepers was forced to go to them and basically explain incidents that got elevated to the vice president level, and the VP would be sitting there. So they explained this incident one day, and the EVP stood up and said, "I want their names, I want them off the property by noon today." And Carl Lindbergh stood up and said, "And that's exactly why you'll never know who these people are." Because that's not how the system was developed. The system was developed to learn from the mistake these people made, pass it along to the rest of the pilots, and move on, okay? I'm happy to say that is not the prevalent thought in the industry anymore. You know, there were people who didn't understand, hey, you can't expect people to come up and tell you what they did wrong and then hammer them. Okay, you're getting data, you're getting information you never would have got. The least you can do is not hammer the people who are, don't shoot the messengers. Okay, I think as an industry over 20 years, I think that message has finally made it through down to the director of safety level and all the way up through the CEO level. I think because they see the value of ASAP and FOQA and GMDAT and CAST and all the rest of it and SIS, I think they've become so used to having that information and that data to work with that they now realize, hey, if I do anything to screw this up and they take it away or we shut down their program, they're going to be in a world of hurt. So they're going to change their tune a bit when it comes to how they're going to handle the messengers bringing the data.
Yeah, and I think I would add that, the present level of safety we could not have achieved, not without the data coming from all of you, first of all, to start the process, not having the trust to archive it and aggregate it at the national level and to be able to develop safety enhancements. I don't think the safety record we have happens without that trust. Yeah. And that's fundamental to our success, and I think we can never lose that. Otherwise, we can't do what we do.
That trust has been the biggest part of this since the beginning, to be honest with you. I have been coming here a lot longer than I realized, but certainly over the past 20 years, I was sitting in the audience as a new volunteer, and we had to really express what these programs were and why they're so important and convince people that they needed to adopt them. And I think because of that trust, there's certainly many ways that data could be misused.
Oh, yeah.
And it hasn't been. So because we've developed that trust and because it's being used for what it was intended for, we've been able to build these programs. We no longer have to convince people, it's assumed, because it's been so successful. So, yeah. Thank you for the question, Frank. All right, now we're ready for Rich Huey.
Sure. Good morning, gentlemen, and thanks for the time you've given us this morning. It's been very informative. Like Steve and Carlos, thank you for all the efforts you've done over the years and continue to do. I'm Rich Huey. I'm an ALPA pilot who flies for FedEx. I'm also on the ALPA Cargo Committee. My question is for any of you, but probably best targeted to Vivek is Jim Dat and CAST recently identified cargo operations as a potential area that needed to improve for CAST to meet its fatality risk reduction goal by 2025. You guys broke out CAST metrics to identify cargo as its own metric, and you stood up a cargo working group. My question is, what did you learn, and can you share some of that with the audience?
Thanks, Rich. We only have 7 minutes. I think what Rich brought up was a very vital point from a CAST perspective. CAST looks at the commercial operations as a whole, and we evaluate things, safety issues, and effectiveness of mitigations at that industry level. When you compare commercial operations, passenger and cargo, the volume of passenger data was kind of masking cargo. And as Rich mentioned, we were able to extract out the cargo metrics to be able to also see what's happening in just the cargo community. Cargo certainly has we sponsored a working group to kind of give us insight into the challenges the cargo community faces, the risks that they're exposed to, and also it helps us then evaluate the safety enhancements. Why are they effective in one area versus the other? Do we need to do something different? So looking at that, the working group is right now still concluding, and we'll be briefing CAST on actions. We evaluated our safety portfolio. We identified areas where we think we can get additional risk reduction that's unique to cargo, looking at our resource portfolio, our current deployed safety enhancements, and also bringing forward safety enhancements that we had developed that didn't meet the business case when we could at the time of the original studies. But now with the technology advancements in other areas, we certainly want to bring it forward. There are differences between cargo and passenger operations, and that gives us that different perspective. So as Rich mentioned, we'll be presenting that to CAST and then moving out on additional measures of safety risk reduction, because we're looking, as we've stated, we're currently operating since CAST at a 96% fatality risk reduction, which is quite remarkable. We need to drive that further. That doesn't mean we're going to hit our target by 2025. It just means we're operating below the target right now. But we need to constantly evaluate where can we get additional risk reduction into the system and move forward. So as we to Rich's point, as we conclude that and bring it to CAST, and when we move forward, that will be something that we can share with the rest of the community. And certainly want to thank Rich and Michael and others that have been part of that community. But more importantly, you kind of refer to us up here, but it's not us, it's all of you that make this possible. A lot of you are on the groups, a lot of you provide your insights, your line operations experience. That's definitely what we need to understand from a cargo community perspective, for example, what the unique risks are. So it helps us better target the mitigation strategies that we develop at a national level.
Okay. Do we have one more question from the crowd?
Hey, good morning, panel, and good morning, guests. I'm Craig Hoskins. I head up safety, security, and technical affairs at the Nissan Cert for Airbus Americas. However, prior to that, Mike Schills and I flew DC-9s together at Northwest way back when our natural highlights were a lot darker than they are now. And then also at JetBlue. And I've also am and still am an ELPA member, have been for 22 years. And it's an honor to be here. And I want to echo Steve, because I also wear the hat of the CAST industry co-chair. And so there's a couple things that I'd like to say. One is a thank you. And I'll tell you, during COVID, presented us some huge challenges. In the GMDAT team, the issue analysis team, we're doing pretty much double and triple time and trying to do it virtually. And the challenge they have now that we're all getting back together is there's so much more that gets done in person. So there was a lot of catch-up, a lot of ramp-up after we started getting back together. And so a couple things that resonate is, one, these programs are built on trust, purely. So when I look at that, they're fragile, because it only takes one event to break that trust, and there's a lot of work that goes in behind that. The other part of it is, everyone in this room also has other day jobs. And these volunteer positions, if you will, IAT, GMDAT, CAST, ASIAS, take a lot of extra effort, but it takes a commitment. It takes a commitment from the individual, and it takes a commitment from your companies and your organizations to be there, because that's what makes the difference. That's what moves the needle. And to piggyback on Vivek, here's the challenge. What got us here today, will it take us where we need to go next? And because we cannot get complacent. And we have to look for ways to do things better, and that's, as we marry things up, like Mike was saying, there was a silo of SIAS and FOQA, there was a silo of ASAP, and bringing that all together is very important. And so for all of us to coalesce, these conferences and the continued commitment that we all have is what's going to get us to the next step as we work together for that. And that's a challenge for all of us. And I'll say it this afternoon in the panel, and the chair of the NTSB mentioned it yesterday, and I mentioned this last June at the FAA EASA conference on a panel. The flying public in the globe, around the world, has zero tolerance for one fatality. And that's a challenge that we all have, and that's the expectation. And it's a high bar to set, but we work with a lot of consummate professionals that can strive for that. And I always say there's no such thing as the perfect flight, because if you felt like you had one, you better quit. You're always striving for perfection, and that's what these organizations are doing. So thanks to all of you for that.
Oh, thank you. I think it's a testament that that's coming from industry as well. It certainly shows that the trust and the programs are effective, and it's much appreciated. We are just about out of time, or we actually are out of time now. If you do have questions, we'll be around. Feel free to talk to us offline, and thank you for coming. Yeah, thank you.